So Elizabeth Pérez is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her first book is Religion in the Kitchen, Cooking, Talking, and the Making of Black Atlantic Traditions. It came out in 2016. And in 2017, Clifford Geertz Prize in the Anthropology of Religion and an honorable mention for the Caribbean Studies Association's 2019 Barbara T. Christian Literature Award. And her new book, it's called The Gut, A Black Atlantic Elementary Tract. So without much more and further ado, and welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'd like to thank, before I begin, I'd like to thank Jean for being such a wonderful host for Odette and Stefan in my last few days here, as well as Donna and everybody else at the ICA that has been so welcoming, and of course everyone here from the seminar. I want to start by saying that I am a product of South Florida. I am myself Cuban American. My family, many members of it live in Hialeah. My mother's in Hollywood. So when I started studying Afro-Cuban religions, it's a little bit ironic that it was not here, but actually when I was in college in Western Massachusetts, and my mentors, who happened to be Jamaican and Puerto Rican, really encouraged me to look into Afro-Cuban religions in particular as places that had been sites of resistance, oppositionality, places that were queer affirming and often women led. And that cut against some of what I had grown up with and the very common stereotype of what is known as Lucumí or Regla Ocha, Orisha worship as Santeria, right? There's this kind of pejorative thrust of that terminology. And I had been asking myself recently, how far back does it go? Because people have been deconstructing Santeria since the 1940s. And I found this dictionary entry from 1809 that defines Santeria as hypocrisy. So I think there's a lot more to mine there, but just to give you a sense of how far back not only stereotypes about Orisha worship go, but also the way in which that saint worship, this idea of the saints being some kind of corrupting influence. This is probably like a very Protestant normative text. But you can sort of see it in the way that popularly Los Santos or the Orishas have been represented. And so what I want to do a little bit in this talk, you'll see I don't have a script, so I'm just trying to walk my way through a new subject for me about the way that practitioners have reimagined or reappropriated the images that they were given, the images that were available to them for representing West and Central African deities, and then have in turn now not only begun to represent them artistically in painting, drawing, sculptures, but through AI, through artificial intelligence technologies that have enabled such a high level of differentiation for the different spirits and to show them how they can approximate sort of a human incarnation. So you can see here, probably many of you know, that Santa Barbara, who was in Europe depicted as a saint, a female saint, who was associated with thunder, with lightning, supposed to have been a princess, and therefore she's depicted with this tower. She got assimilated to quote-unquote Shango, who in Yoruba land or in pre-colonial West Africa was associated with lightning, especially lightning that struck houses of evildoers and liars. So the missionaries will tell us, right, that was Shango's brief. And there's been a kind of semi-ironic reappropriation of this. At the bottom, you can see that this is actually a kind of meme that shows up in social media. And this very common phrase that Cubans say, yo tengo de Congo, de Carabalí. I have both from, Carabalí kind of symbolizes West Africa, Congo symbolizes Central Africa. that there's nobody Cuban, no hay cubano que no tiene de Congo, de Kalevalí, right? It's been kind of illustrated here by this image of both Santa Barbara and this more, we could say, historically accurate Shango here, who is actually of black skin, highly melanated, darker skin. But it's a little bit ironic because there's no Europe, right? It's not el que no tiene de Congo, tiene de Kalevalí o de Europa. You know, like the European is just kind of seen as, in some ways, a strange default for the meme. Pre-colonially, you could say, although folks like Stefan and others would very rightly, I think, want to unpack the essentialisms involved in kind of like painting with such a broad brush pre-colonial representational conventions. But nevertheless, it seems to be the case that for Shango in particular, when Shango is represented, or in when there are power objects that pertain to Shango, like this oshe that a woman is holding here, or we can say a priest of Shango is holding in both hands, that's a dance wand called an oshe. It's like a double-headed axe. And you can see it's not actually Shango himself. It's a woman who often has like very protruding breasts, and her the double-headed axe is sprouting out of her head. So what's going on, right? You may ask. Well, what we're seeing is a kind of representation of the ideal religious subject, the ideal devotee of Shango's, who is a woman. It's very important to think about the way that, unlike some of the world religions we're familiar with, that a lot of West and Central African religious traditions are arguably female normative. It's women's experience that's privileged. We see this in many sites of Afro-diasporic practice as well. But you see that her eyes are wide open and quite large, and that often is citing spirit possession. So it's a kind of marker of a religious subject that so embodies the deity that she's kind of in some ways become the vehicle for the deity himself, and she's got probably a ram that is about to be sacrificed, because that is Shango's food also in Lukumi. And so these dance wands, in some way, they have a much more complicated and not at all straightforward relationship to what they're representing, because there's the mediation of the devotee. There's the depiction within the object itself, a kind of like coalescence of both the deity and the practitioner. And another way we can think about this is when we see possession priests for Shango, and J. Lauren Matori has written probably the most extensively about this, that priests for Shango in particular dress as women, or to say they dress as brides. They dress as wives because there is a metaphoricity around marriage, that one marries the god in order to venerate them. And so these priests are seen in possession here. And priest is kind of a funny word because it connotes maybe a lot of Christian ideas. The term in Yoruba would be elegun, which is to say someone who is bounded by the deity, somebody who is possessed by the deity. So this would have been, thinking back to the pre-colonial period, the period of the transatlantic slave trade, the image of Shango that people might have had in their minds. And there were a number of different ethnic groups. We discussed in the seminars the way that these ethnonyms arose to talk about different groups of people with different languages, with different cultures that found themselves ensnared in the slave trade. These are just some of the groups that were brought to Cuba as listed by Fernando Ortiz. And these Lukumi groups are the groups that I'm sort of talking about today in terms of Regla Ocha. You'll note, however, perhaps Eguado, Oyo, Ife, Iesha, those are place names. Those are not names for ethnicities per se or nations yet. But in the pre-colonial period, with the rise of the nation state, people are still really identifying themselves as citizens or residents of a particular place, and not yet and other kinds of subjects that are yet to come. But these Lukumi groups, as others, were placed into what were called cabildos. And cabildos are very interesting institutions, and they parallel what in Brazil were called hermandades, or brotherhoods. They first arose, in fact, in the 1500s in Europe, in Lisbon and Seville, because there were such large numbers of free and enslaved African people on the Iberian Peninsula that the clergy got nervous, the crown, the different monarchs were nervous. How are we going to Christianize these formerly enslaved people, these free black populations? And their solution was, let's give them space within the parish. Small budgets, maybe rooms, or access to saint statues and other images. And that's a way to socialize these people of African descent into the worship of the Catholic God through veneration of the Virgin Mary, through veneration of the saints. And this quote is taken from David Brown, who has done extensive work on cabildos. And this idea that Black people, de nación, okay, by nation, because they are being called nations, they have their own cabildo. They're not supposed to mix free people from enslaved people, white folks with people of African descent, people who were born in Cuba, criollos, were not supposed to mix with people who were born in Africa. Bozales, who were newly arrived, who did not yet speak Spanish, who were not yet completely, quote unquote, seasoned. They were not supposed to mix with people who were already supposedly acculturated. But that's what happened, right? That's precisely what took place in these cabildos, because you can't put people in these spaces without assuming, especially within this context, that they're going to find a way to try to retake their power. And one of the ways that they retook their power was remembering and reimagining what their spiritual worlds might have looked like, using the materials given to them by the Catholic Church. And so throughout Havana, this is just one example of Havana en Regla, you have all of these cabildos. But ¿qué pasó? What happened is that people who were not Lukumi, people who were maybe affiliated with Kanga, or people who were described as Carabali, who maybe spoke some Ekpe dialect, they started to actually enjoy the way that the Lukumi performed their nationhood in processions and in celebrations like the 6th of January, King's Day, where many groups of different African peoples would take to the streets and sort of dress up and show what, culturally, how they wanted to express themselves, at least for that day. So Lukumi became not an ethnonym, a name for a fixed kind of ethnic group with a certain language, with a certain phenotype, but it became a kind of name for a culture and a group of people who, among other things, worshiped the Orisha and venerated the ancestors, the Egun. Right. And the crown was actually not oblivious to what was going on, but they also felt like very constrained to control it because of very early on, this is a list of some of the rebellions of enslaved people that took place at a very early date in Cuba. And Aisha Finch has written a wonderful book, Rethinking Slave Rebellion in Cuba. This is not a history that we often hear about, that from jump, every enslaved person is taking every opportunity possible to try to become free, to self-liberate. And what's really crucial to think about is that in Cuba, one of the most important cabildos, which was called Cabildo Changotedun, it was implicated in rebellion and Jose Antonio Aponte, who you see here, he was the leader of that cabildo. He was also a veteran. He was a kind of polymath. He was a painter. He was a thinker, somebody who, I don't know, to think about what a synthetic figure he is, I can only point to somebody like Sun Ra. He almost had like an Afrofuturist kind of sensibility, it seems like, although all of his materials were destroyed when he was actually executed because he was fingered as the one who fomented this rebellion. So cabildos were also these sites where people associated in order to kind of strategize. How are we going to overthrow if not the crown, how are we going to get free? And so within those cabildos, there's the generation of the associations with the saints, such that figures like Santa Barbara, even today, this is a cabildo in Palmira that is quite famous. And, we're still in COVID times, but this is earlier in the pandemic. You can see people wearing face masks. There is not necessarily the kind of masking that is the dominant narrative. If we Google very quickly the association of Orishas with saints, there's no real evidence that anyone was fooled, that if you went into, let's say, a drum ritual in the late 1800s, that a statue for Santa Barbara was essentially, in any sense, a kind of camouflage for the Orishas. It was a game, it seemed to be like a kind of game that was played and deference that was given to the Catholic Church, but without ever conceding that it was a white gaze or a European gaze that was looking at these spirits as they were reappropriated, but it was actually, they were understood through the experience of Afro-Cuban people. So, today this process is really interesting to think about because no longer do people have to just accept images that are given to them and deploy them in oppositional ways. But people have the tools through AI to really re-envision them, to plug in exactly the terms that you want to see brought into the mix, right? And so here on the right, you can see a kind of vision of Shango that is resplendent, that, he has corals, he has like very large cowrie shells that have a lot of significance in Lukumi. Here we see him, very fiery. There's a whole pataki or an Afro-Cuban religious story about his, using fire magic. And it actually goes really, quite wrong. But, in this context, he's the king who's also the warrior. And his strength is at the fore. And also here, a revalorization of dark skin, of melanated complexions that in Cuba is really quite recent and still in progress because of white supremacist beauty standards and anti-Blackness more generally. So to take another case and just to kind of walk you through, these are some images that have been described as portraying Yemaya, that are Yoruba sculptures, Yemaya being the Orisha of maternity. The kind of long breasts, especially, they are supposed to index lactation, that this is a woman who has breastfed or she's, actively mothering, and also that association with blue, that here you can see there's a kind of a powder that's rubbed into the sculpture to create that beautiful blue. In Cuba, she gets associated with La Virgen de Regla, and you might, some of you might be quite familiar with that. And that image actually, you can find as far back as this Gumpenberg text from the 1650s. That's actually the Virgin of León, that later is taken up as La Virgen Nuestra Señora de Regla. What's curious, however, you note that she has a dark melanated face, we could say, although in this context she's one of many Black Madonnas in Europe. And you can ask me if you would like in the break about that. But she's carrying a white child. And that gets reproduced over and over again, first in lithographs, and then in the 1860s and 70s, there's the ability to replicate or to create reproductions of such images, but with vibrant color. However, we see her in sculptures in churches, and even these mass-produced kind of images you might find in a botanica originate from these much, much earlier images. And as they start to be disseminated in the Americas, in fact, some of the earliest chromolithographic technologies come from Mexico. They come to be disseminated by the Catholic Church as also a way, again, socializing not just enslaved people, but really all Catholics into a kind of relationship with the saints, here La Virgen. This is a image of La Virgen de Regla above her church in the city of Regla in Cuba. It's a very, very common image. And I've somehow skipped ahead, but you can see Angelitos Blancos, right? We start off the seminar with Anthony Maralda's wonderful short video, Santa Comida, and one of the songs that he uses is Angelitos Negros, precisely because the representational convention has been that these angels are going to be white. But in cabildos in Cuba, there are often statues that, through their engagement with Afro-Cuban members of the cabildos, have become sacralized. Sometimes those statues that were processed through the streets were actually charged with different substances so that they would be likened to the Orisha that would be embodied in vessels on people's altars. This is the one that was processed of La Virgen de Regla, of the Cabildo Yamaya, of Josefina Herrera, also known as Echubi. She was the daughter of a very important priest, Adechina, who we discussed this week. He was a property owner, one of the first Ifa priests in Cuba. He commissioned maybe the second set of consecrated bata drums. And she's seen as being very elderly here, being held up by two people as she walked. But Josefina Tarafa captured an image of, I think this probably was Omitoque, her rivals, Susana Cantero's Virgin of Regla, processed through the streets at the beginning of September, which would take place in the late 1800s and early 1900s with humongous crowds. And they, Josefina, Pepa Herrera, and Susana Cantero actually had a very active rivalry to see whose processions could be the biggest, basically, and the most successful. And so practitioners have taken up this image, and these are wonderful pictures from David Brown's work, where you could see that on top of the consecrated materials of Yamaya at a celebration for a priest's anniversary of when they got initiated, that there's actually a doll that has been made to kind of sit at the top of a sopera or a tureen that would have the consecrated materials of Yamaya. And then behind it, there's a image of that Virgin of Regla with the white child. I argue in some of my earlier work that one of the reasons that La Virgen de Regla became associated with Yamaya is because of the histories of Afro-Cuban women and often the position that they were put in to have to mother white women's children. And if not to actually nurse them, but to have to give them care, to have to clean up after them, to the point of exhaustion, and also the way that they were sexually exploited. And the degree to which the mythology of Yamaya in Cuba has to do with sexual assault, has to do with not just motherhood in general, but like her being exploited as a mother. Whereas if we look at mythologies for her in, let's say, present-day West Africa, in Nigeria, among Yoruba people, that element is really, it's not prominent at all. It's not really a thread that runs through her mythology. So I've argued that Black women in particular taking up Yamaya in the image of Regla in some ways fought against the stereotypes of them that were everywhere. And so these are, for example, marquillas. These are like these little comics that would appear in cigar boxes. So if you bought a box of cigars, you might buy series of different marquillas that would show different kinds of puns or like social situations. And this one showing, a barefoot, pregnant Afro-Cuban woman, and averia is kind of like a loss, a specific kind of loss. And that, I think, points to the way that when some enslaved women were impregnated, they were considered to be a loss because they couldn't work for a certain amount of time when they were heavily pregnant. But there are all kinds of other, like, quite nasty and racist implications. And Black women, just over and over again, you can imagine all of the stereotypes that are quite similar to North American stereotypes of Black women that showed up not just in popular culture, in visual images, but in blackface minstrelsy genres. And so these are a couple of the books that talk about how unambiguously Black women, like the ones I'm talking about, as well as mixed race women or mulata women, were basically burlesqued and diminished. And so when we come to the point that in Cuba, there is a recognition of the Orishas as part of Cuban national cultural patrimony, it is a very mixed process because you cannot really trust a representational regime to take up figures of African descent and not somehow burden them with some kind of distortion. And so, for example, when we see Orishas like this sometimes figured online where, there are all these dark figures, but Ogun is very dark. The warriors are often, depicted in, how do I put this? A very crude fashion. Oshun here is much lighter skinned. She's portrayed as being very coquettish, flirtatious. She often is represented in a way that draws from these minstrelsy genres of her being almost like a seductress. And so I'll come back to that point, but we see in the representation likewise of Yemaya or Regla, when she is represented in popular culture as opposed to by practitioners, she often is kind of flattened. She doesn't necessarily portray all of the complexities that practitioners would have added if they had had the power to represent her in those arenas. It's really artists like Manuel Mendive and others who begin to complexify the images of the Orishas and insert their own commentary and critique, which I believe Mendive is doing here. This is a Yemaya, I believe from the early 2000s, but Carmela Haynes' work. Carmela Haynes is actually an African-American artist. And here she's using the girth in particular, which in the Cuban context, when she's represented as being voluptuous, we could even say, there are all kinds of euphemisms that you could use, but she's depicted traditionally as being heavy set. And when she's depicted that way in popular culture, it's almost like a mammy image. Okay, that's like precisely what is being indexed. But artists have taken that and said, no, it's a revalorization of the body, of the way that she not only offers a lot as a mother, but she actually revels in, having more to love, having her be a large and unapologetically, we could say, fat woman. Armonia Rosales, an Afro-Cuban artist from Chicago, has really embarked probably on the most thorough rethinking or revisualization of the Orishas to date. And here you see that Yemaya is weeping. She also has the fish that are associated with her as the Orisha of the ocean. And just to kind of give you a sense of Rosales' project, I can show you one of the paintings that broke the internet. a few years ago when she posted this, I believe first on IG. And of course, it's a re-envisioning, right, of the famous Michelangelo image. And one of the things about it that, I guess was so scandalous is not just that you have, two Black women and more, right, as the angels, but that they have, natural, quote unquote, Afro-textured hair. They are unmistakably, right, a deified figures, even though, the Eve here is human, but this is, a creation myth that has been taken up by many. And so then when Armonia Rosales depicts Yemaya, this is actually called the Assumption of Yemaya because she's playing with the Catholic representational history. She's shown with that voluptuosity, but taking cues in some ways from the previous Cuban depictions of Yemaya, either with her head covered or not having hair, because there's this kind of there's this terminology in Cuba that to have Afro-textured hair of a certain type, that uno no tiene pelo. I'm sure many of us have heard that, right? Que somebody no tiene pelo. And they, of course, have hair. It's just not hair that's valorized, but, within white supremacist beauty standards. And so Armonia Rosales goes in a very interesting direction here with trying to somehow convey what that could mean. Now, I noticed in maybe 2009, 2010, that there was the emergence of these memes with the Orishas in them that often depicted fashion models and, just taking pages out of fashion magazines and sort of superimposing the names of Orishas and sort of messages from the Orishas on them. This is one I just, that just popped up today. Okay. And I should translate. So it says, Yemaya dice, because there's always, if there's a voiceover, it's kind of like this very dramatic thing. You know how Cubans are, muy dramático. Yemaya dice, todo el mal que te hagan, deséjalo a Yemaya. No hagas nada, no digas nada. Pon todo en manos de Yemaya. I didn't even notice I didn't translate it. Yemaya says, all the bad shit that they do to you, all the bad that they do to you, leave it to Yemaya. Don't do anything. Deje solo a Yemaya. No, don't do anything. Don't say anything. So this idea that, the Orishas will take care of it, right? And there's a kind of immediacy and reality that is different when you use a photograph of a person. When you see a person there, there is a way that there's a kind of force that image has that it doesn't necessarily have if it's just a drawing. And so this is a more AI take. Put everything in the hands of Yemaya, and you will see Yemaya's hands in everything, which is really pretty interesting. And so practitioners now, they're able to, in some ways, go beyond what artists have done in the sense that they can create specifically the image that they want to see. And so one of my questions is, what do some practitioners want to see today, right? So, I've talked so far about Afro-Cuban practitioners, African-American practitioners, and some of these images are without attribution, but I will give attribution as I found it. So this is, for example, an image of Yemaya with a kind of her ill-fated consort, Inle, and you can see just immediately how thin Yemaya is. And in fact, within even the Cuban context, this would not have been considered attractive until very recently because the aesthetic around bodily form is this would have been considered skin and bones, right, from my mother's generation or my grandmother's generation. But this is more of a fashion model aesthetic. It also, takes in some ways from the repertoire of romance novel, covers. And there is a kind of melodrama that is palpable in some of the images that are created. This is a local artist who's also a dancer, sought after as a tailor for ritual vestments. for practitioners of Lukumi, who goes by Chango Bonito on social media. Hernandez Gonzalez, very much involved in the cultural life of Miami, but also travels. He's become, I don't want to say purveyor because I don't know that he sells the images, but he often will post these images on social media. And you can see Yamaya. And what I find interesting is that they have a pedagogical function too, because people, let's say, trying to Google, who is Yamaya, right? They can look at this image, they can see, okay, boats, okay, rough waters, anchors, she's associated with coral, she's wealthy, right? And you'll see actually that there is not just a general, I think, we could say precedent for the way that this Yamaya looks or the way that female Orishas look in fashion or in modeling in general, but there are these South Sudanese models like Adura Cage. I made a list for myself. There is Ajak Deng, Atuai Deng. And I can imagine that if you're trying to think about, if you type in beautiful Black woman or beautiful woman of African descent, what is, AI going to come up with? And it's going to be drawing on some way the images of these models. And there are many more than just 7. So you can see those faces come up. And so there's this kind of interesting way that practitioners in some ways are breaking from the past, breaking from representational norms, daring to make Yamaya skinny, daring to kind of, draw her with much hair. You can see all the beautiful hair that she has here. But also by making them hyper-specific in the past, because the Orishas, most of them have more than one sort of avatar. The term avatar has been used, or instantiation. It's the idea that the Orishas are, they have different moments in their lives, as we know from divination verses, in which they existed and had different experiences. And so this is the Mayelewo Yamaya. She's associated often with crockery, with these dishes or with jars. And there's a whole mythology around, when Mayelewo is angry, she breaks all the plates and the dishes. Asesu, for whom I have a particular affection, she's seen here she's associated with swans. Many people will say she's actually quite old, but you'll see that the artist has given us some background. She's, Asesu is the Yamaya of the shore, la desmemoriada. She's the one that is the forgetful one. She's the owner of ducks, of swans, of gansos, geese. This is another Yamaya image. And so you can see how there's an effort to convey a kind of glamour in the Orishas. And that also, I think, marks that people are less acomplejado and kind of... they're less reluctant to admit that they are santeros or that they practice lukumi. And there's a kind of emergence of a sort of pride that, yes, I'm a part of this incredibly rich religious culture. And so there's a kind of outward-looking quality to these images that I find really fascinating. Here is Achaba, who is an older path, but also, face card, is not going to decline and not a wrinkle, right? That Botox is working, all the Juvederm or whatever is going on, right? Not to say that this, person ever would have needed it, but there's a way too, though, that, and this is my disquiet, I guess, is that in AI, very, very often people will not include wrinkles, scars, evidence of the kinds of very human traumas and the afflictions of aging that actually do happen to the Orishas in narrative, in divination verses and other stories about them, like Pataquines. I also wanted to note, I'm not saying that representing their paths is a totally new innovation. We see here in the case of the Orishas in Candomblé Nago or Ketu. There's an artist like Felipe Caprini who has been showing, Ogunte looks like this, Asesu looks like that, because there is a whole range of different color codings. So one of the things that it implies when I say that the Orishas are being represented as instantiations of their paths is that certain colors are being used, certain implements. You can see the sword here. Also, Asesu is depicted often with a bow and arrow because of her association with Ochosi. And this is just a book about Yamaya in Brazil, but the different paths are indexed by different color combinations, right? So turning just really quickly to Oshun, there's something very similar that's happening. But in the Cuban context, Oshun has not generally been thought of as unambiguously Black, but Black with some ambiguity, which is to say upwardly mobile, lighter skin, phenotypically a little more on the Spanish side. But even that, women of mixed race were never able to escape the anti-Blackness of their representation as being seducers of white men, as being gold diggers. We can even think, now to representations of lighter-skinned Black women and all of the fetishization that women experience in real life as a result. This is, of course, La Caridad del Cobre, the Blessed Virgin Mary, that is the patron of Cuba, is this virgin. But she is often read as light-skinned as she looks, or as white as she looks, as mulata, even in a kind of iconic statue as this one. And so drawing on, again, these marquillas, this popular culture around Black women as being suspected of just wanting to leave behind Blackness, suspected of wanting to marry into a white family and create ever lighter skinned children. There's a kind of whole body, a corpus of images that can speak to the way that mulatas were, we can say, denigrated. When that image of the mixed race woman comes to represent Oshun, it is often, again, it's in that not entirely positive light. Often, she's been referred to, quote unquote, as the holy whore, because there's this kind of this white gaze, basically, that is pertaining to her as someone in control of her sexuality. And Oshun is nothing but intelligent, nothing if not sophisticated. We can say that her feminine wiles are indeed weapons of the weak, or the kind of tactics that she uses to turn situations to advantage. And you can see in this image by Alberto del Pozo, right here, there's kind of like Virgen de la Caridad del Pobre peeking out from the edge. And then the central figure is depicted not just with the kind of iconic peacock feathers that she has, but also quail. She's associated with quails and pheasants as well. And these images from Alberto del Pozo that we can find here in South Florida in the Cuban Heritage Collection at UM, all of them contain some kind of little hint in the image of, what is the Roman Catholic iconographic precedent, and then how Alberto del Pozo is kind of trying to bring in the different paths to show the Orishas for who they are. So Carmela Haynes kind of turns on its head the stereotypes of Oshun and shows Oshun, proudly bearing her breast, looking in a mirror, because that's often how she dances, with her hand held up as if she's looking into a mirror. But she's not really that light-skinned Oshun at all. She is, again, reclaiming her darkness. And Michael Harris, this is a beautiful painting, or I should say, I think it's mixed media, Penance for Oshun, it's called. by Michael Harris. And she's showing an older Oshun, which we often don't see. We often see the young, vivacious Oshun, and not the Oshun that was poor, not the Oshun who lost everything, not the Oshun who had to have Yemaya raise her twins because she lost them in her pursuit of Shango, who was not really capable of nurturing her as a partner. Maria Magdalena Campos Pons does not point to the Orishas in this depiction. It's called Replenishing from 2001, but there is a sort of Yemaya, I would say, associated figure on the left who has the alekes, the sacred beads of Yemaya, and they're intertwined with the sacred beads of Oshun that are being held by the figure on the right. And you can see a kind of more complex relationship between them. It's often said that some practitioners are dos aguas, that their mother is both Yemaya and Oshun, their patron. And you can see their entanglement, as you will find also in the mythology. Questions surrounding their relationship include, maybe they're sisters. Maybe Yemaya is not Oshun's mother, but nevertheless, in many pataquinas, she raises Oshun's children. And Harmonia Rosales has a particularly ingenious way of depicting Oshun that I've discussed in another lecture that you might find online, because I had the honor of helping with an exhibit of Harmonia Rosales' works at UCSB. And I talk about how Rosales has Oshun depicted with vitiligo. And that's her way of kind of, in some ways, reclaiming a lightness or a lighter skin for Oshun, but not ever suggesting that she is mixed race. That, there's a way that, she, as in this image, right, that I had the great pleasure of seeing in person. You can see that she has, parts of her body, patches of skin that are lighter. But, I think it's very important for Rosales that none of the Orishas are depicted as being, of having any European ancestry. And so sometimes she will depict some Orishas as having albinism. And I do have some images I could show, but I don't want to run too long. So we can see Oshun has locks here, right? She can have locks. She doesn't have to have any of the styles that we've seen so far, or no hair. There's a vendor on Etsy, Mafrefun Los Orishas, that depicts Ibu Acuaro, like a one particular path of Oshun here. And again, we see this effort to show what are the key features of that path, so that practitioners can actually, in some ways, draw the Orisha closer, relate the Orisha to oneself more vividly than just by, going and buying maybe a statuette botanica. This is Chango Bonito's image of Ibu Cole. And you can see here it's very, very different, right? There are vultures. Ibu Cole is a path that's known for working with the mothers or the Iyami, who, that's a long story, but Aje in the Yoruba context are women who have particular kinds of witchcraft and magic. So that in part informs this image. Right. And in some ways, this is taking off from a project like James C. Lewis's. He's an African-American photographer, I should say. But I believe that these photographs that he made of the Orishas were actually staged with sitters. He had particular models sit for him. And I have a lot of curiosity about where practitioners are going to take this. I myself was initiated in 2016, and I have a lot to learn about what I study. And so I will be hoping to ask more about what are people's motivations for putting into the public sphere images like this? What kinds of stereotypes are they hoping to contest? And is there a way to really ever depict the Orisha outside of ritual that is true to life, that honors them with the depth and the scope that they deserve? Thank you so much.
I'll keep it to 2 questions. So I'm wondering, are you thinking about the relationship, because we're talking here about AI technologies, are you thinking about the relationship of virality, right? So like when an image goes viral, and I don't know that it's helpful at all, but I'm just thinking about this because think about like the virality of sacred images, which go out and go out and go out. And so that relationship between virality and sacredness or sacrality. And also, I'm really interested, and I wonder if you've thought about what happens here, especially with AI, in this relationship between specificity and non-specificity, right? Because AI is not real people, but it's just drawn in a different way than painting or sculpture from images or components of real people. And I'm thinking about that, the relationship between Orishas and individuals, practitioners, So yeah, those 2 things, I guess.
Yeah, so I'd like to say I'm thinking about virality, but it really has not yet sort of crystallized in my mind how that works. There are people with large followings who often will post. I mean, Chango Bonito, who I mentioned, he'll post like an album of 10 images of Yamaya of different paths, right? And it seems like people really relate to those. And I was checking out some other Facebook groups, and it seems like they're actually plagiarized. People will cut. And then that's the kind of thing that wouldn't show up in the algorithm necessarily, because if you don't repost and people are just, taking screenshots and not attributing it to him, right? It's kind of delicate. I mean, I'm sure there's a way to research this, so that would be a great idea. And in terms of the way, so there's a strange combination of hyper reality, but also airbrushing, right? And so, in an image like this, you can see that, there's an angularity to the figure, strength for sure. Again, my mother's generation would just cringe and say, oh my gosh, this person has not had enough to eat. But nevertheless, this is like high fashion aesthetics. But people are always talking about, you can still find AI images that are they give themselves away because they have too many fingers, or it's like strange kinds of things that you don't notice right at first. But I mean, the technology is keeping pace, right? And so I think maybe some of the things now that would mark this as a more painterly image will be eliminated. And maybe also, and now I don't have as much of a technical vocabulary as I would need to really discuss this, but the way the layers are done with the lighting, I think, has a lot to do with whether we take an image to be a photograph or some other kind of production, right? So and I'm quite sure Akisi Britton has written a wonderful recent article about how practitioners on social media depict the Orishas in terms of race, and kind of an uproar that was caused in one group when folks were depicting Yamaya as white, and which is a longstanding convention in Brazil because there's a certain image that's used for Yamaya, but it has not been the case in the Cuban context. So that's Akisi Britton, and I'll urge you to look at that if you're interested, and Google their name.
Thank you.
The K. Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like a lot of the AI images, they're depicted as like very thin. And you said that this was like sort of breaking of representational norms. But do you think that also it could be like, I don't know, like subsuming contemporary body standards and like how, people try and look today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of these images, let's say they're aspirational. I mean, they depict sort of what in our cultural moment is held out as being let's say in the Miami Design District, right? Like the body that is the mannequin, or like the perfect hanger for a set of designer clothes. I think one way that it's, subverting the previous convention is that showing the strength of, and sort of putting that emphasis on the musculature. That I think in some ways messes with ideas of masculinity and femininity a little bit, although I wouldn't go that far. I would say that, these Sudanese models and other African models are really the template. I think it will get really interesting when more and more queer and trans practitioners of these traditions get their hands on the same AI and really start creating images that are not fat phobic, that are not colorist, that are not necessarily binary. They're not, here, there are depictions of Oshun that, just straight up look like pornographic. And I think there's a way to, subvert by including different keywords. But I feel like that moment is coming. And what I've seen for the most part is like more conventional understandings of what, beauty standards are. So you can see that here, I think, a little bit. And I think one of the things that I wanted to say is that artists like Armonia Rosales, but going back to Mendive and even earlier, they grappled with, like, what are the implications of our depictions of the Orishas? And my concern here, at the same time, I can appreciate the pedagogical piece. I can appreciate that people have now started to see the Orishas as glamorous and not as embarrassing or folkloric. But what do we lose? Like, do we lose anything in having them be so, effectively gentrifying the images of the Orishas? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everybody.